Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. I'm your host, and I'm sitting down with our resident expert today to go through a really remarkably dense stack of sources.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we've got a very thought-provoking text to explore today, centered around a piece titled The Rise and Fall of Mencho's CJNG Empire.
Exactly. And our mission for you, the listener, is to unpack how a single individual managed to architect one of the most formidable organizations in modern history. And perhaps more importantly, explore why finally removing him from the equation didn't actually solve the underlying problem.
Looking through these notes, the immediate takeaway is that this is a study in organizational behavior. It's about supply chain logistics and systemic vulnerability.
Right. So if you're approaching this expecting a standard, cops and robbers narrative,
The source material quickly disabuses you of that notion.
oh, absolutely. We are examining a masterclass in exploiting global economic systems. That is the perfect framework for this. I want you to imagine the ultimate corporate rise to power story. The scrappy founder who starts with nothing and builds an international conglomerate.
But set squarely within the illicit global drug trade.
Exactly. That's essentially the trajectory we are dealing with today. So let's jump right in and look at the architect of this empire, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, universally known as El Mencho.
The sources paint a stark picture of his beginnings. He was a deported, low-level dealer. He was effectively operating at the absolute bottom of the illicit hierarchy.
Which is wild because usually being deported and starting from scratch, that ends a career in that specific illicit market.
Right. The documentation highlights his complete lack of inherited capital. He didn't step into a leadership role within an existing syndicate.
Okay, let's unpack this because the pivot he makes here is staggering. After being deported, he didn't just return to the local distribution network. El Mencho became a police officer.
And that is the foundational architecture for everything that followed.
But how does a shift like that actually influence the creation of a massive illicit enterprise? Going from dealing to wearing a badge.
Well, he acquired institutional knowledge. Wearing that badge provided an all-access pass to the internal mechanisms of the state apparatus designed to combat illicit networks.
So he wasn't just observing law enforcement from the outside anymore.
Exactly. He was trained in its methodologies. He learned the bureaucratic rhythms, the jurisdictional frictions between different departments, and the exact protocols for investigations.
Think about what happens when the person hired to guard the vault is the one mapping out the heist. That is exactly what we are looking at here.
It fundamentally changes the risk assessment model of a criminal enterprise. When you understand how the system operates, you understand exactly where the blind spots are.
And the source material emphasizes that this background gave him a masterclass in systemic corruption.
Yes, he learned the practical mechanics of compromising an institution. He learned who held the actual leverage in a department, the precise market rate for turning a blind eye, and how to structure financial incentives so they wouldn't trigger internal audits.
He weaponized the system's own procedural weaknesses against it. It's essentially using the structural blueprints of the police force to build an organization designed to completely evade it.
Which led directly to the formation of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or the CJNG.
Right, and according to the text, under his leadership, the CJNG achieved immense operational dominance. The sources outline three distinct pillars that built this empire. The first pillar being a major shift in the actual product they moved.
Specifically, a heavy focus on synthetic drugs like fentanyl and methamphetamine.
Which feels like a massive departure from the legacy organizations that relied so heavily on agricultural products.
What's fascinating here is that the shift to synthetics represents a complete decoupling from geography and agrarian cycles.
Because traditional illicit agriculture relies on massive plots of land, right?
Yes, specific weather conditions, harvest seasons, and a highly visible workforce. It is incredibly vulnerable to aerial eradication campaigns and environmental factors.
But synthetics change that completely.
Synthetics transform the operation from an agricultural vulnerability into a highly scalable, purely industrial manufacturing model.
So they are essentially trading farmers for chemists and mountainsides for warehouses.
The text highlights the sheer scalability of this approach. As long as you can secure the supply chain for precursor chemicals, you can run a synthetic laboratory continuously, 24 hours a day, regardless of the season.
It unchains the production rate from natural limitations.
Furthermore, the potency-to-weight ratio of a drug like fentanyl fundamentally alters the logistics of smuggling.
Because it's so much more potent than traditional narcotics.
Exactly. A significantly smaller physical volume generates a vastly larger profit margin. You're moving a fraction of the physical product for multiple of the revenue.
Which means the transportation logistics become much easier to obscure, while the capital generated just skyrockets. And that massive influx of capital funded their second pillar.
The muscle. Because you cannot run a highly lucrative, illicit manufacturing base without securing it.
The source explicitly points out that under El Mencho, the CJNG operated with the efficiency and tactics of a paramilitary force. How did they structure this kind of muscle compared to traditional syndicate enforcers?
The phrase military precision used in the analysis is critical here. Instead of relying on decentralized networks of local street-level enforcers, the CJNG modeled its security apparatus on specialized tactical units.
And this is where his background in law enforcement probably provided the organizational template again.
Absolutely. We are looking at rigid chains of command, standardized tactical gear, encrypted communications, and heavily armored convoys.
So it's helpful to visualize this not as a neighborhood turf war, but as a heavily armed corporate security division operating with the logistics of a small national army.
They operated with standard operating procedures designed to hold territory and project overwhelming force against both rival syndicates and state security forces.
But equipping a force like that requires massive logistical support, which brings us to the third pillar highlighted in our sources: unintended enablers.
Specifically, external factors and policies that inadvertently facilitated the cartel's massive growth.
And I want to be very clear with you here. We are strictly relaying the analytical facts presented in our source material. We are remaining totally neutral and objective, just reporting on how cross-border policies inadvertently created loopholes the cartel exploited.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes a mathematical reality of sharing an expansive international border with a massive commercial firearms market.
So how did historical arms smuggling factor into this paramilitary buildup?
The source indicates that the CJNG utilized established historical smuggling routes heading south to secure the necessary hardware.
So they leveraged the astronomical profits from the synthetic drug trade to systematically tap into the secondary arms market.
Exactly. Moving high-powered weaponry across the border to outfit their tactical units. It was a purely logistical supply and demand equation.
And the text points out a second external factor: certain trade agreements. Based purely on the logistics outlined in the source, how does the infrastructure of a legitimate trade agreement inadvertently provide a shield for an illicit syndicate?
It comes down to the concept of statistical dilution. Trade agreements are structurally designed to reduce friction at ports of entry to maximize economic velocity.
Meaning they drastically increase the volume of commercial traffic?
Yes, thousands of cargo trucks and rail cars moving across the border every single day.
When an economy relies on that level of rapid logistical movement, it becomes mathematically impossible to thoroughly inspect every shipment.
Not without causing cascading failures in the legitimate supply chain.
So the sheer volume of legitimate commerce provides the perfect camouflage.
The CJNG recognized that the legal infrastructure built to integrate massive economies offered an unparalleled logistical shield.
By integrating their synthetic product into legitimate commercial shipping channels, they effectively hid their illicit operations within the overwhelming denominator of global trade.
The sheer scale of the legitimate economy became the very mechanism that allowed the criminal enterprise to scale its distribution.
They took an insider's knowledge of the state apparatus, pivoted to a highly scalable synthetic manufacturing model, protected it with a paramilitary force, and utilized international trade to move the product. It is a deeply complex corporate architecture.
But even the most sophisticated empires faced disruptions.
Which brings us to the climax of the source material, the year 2026, when El Mencho was captured. So what does this all mean? You remove the architect, the former police officer who built this global syndicate, and you'd naturally expect a happy ending. You assume the organization crumbles.
But the sources reveal a much darker reality. His capture actually triggered a terrifying wave of narco-terrorism.
Why didn't CJNG just collapse when they lost their CEO?
This raises a really important point about the resilience of decentralized corporate structures. There is a tendency to view criminal networks as strict autocracies, where removing the central figure instantly dismantles the regime.
Right, the kingpin strategy.
Exactly. However, the CJNG had evolved far beyond a personality-driven syndicate. It was a deeply entrenched, highly profitable international supply chain.
So the capture of the founder created an immediate power vacuum at the executive level, but the physical infrastructure of the corporation remained entirely intact.
The synthetic laboratories are still fully operational. The precursor chemicals are still arriving at the ports.
And the commercial trucking routes are still moving across the border.
The institutional framework did not vanish. Comparing their supply chain to legitimate global logistics networks provides the clearest perspective here.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the chief executive of a massive international shipping conglomerate is unexpectedly removed, the distribution centers do not close, the cargo ships do not stop sailing, and the regional managers do not abandon their posts.
Because the underlying economic incentives driving the machine forward remain unchanged.
Exactly. So the wave of narco-terrorism described in the text was essentially a violent, heavily armed corporate restructuring.
Multiple highly trained factions within the organization began fighting to seize control of these incredibly lucrative supply chain assets.
It is the ultimate hydra effect. The infrastructure is simply too profitable and too decentralized to just shut down.
The chemists still know how to synthesize the fentanyl, the tactical units still possess their weaponry, and the systemic corruption they built into the border crossings is still functionally in place.
The prize is just too enormous for the remaining leadership to walk away from. The conflict was not necessarily driven by ideology or retribution.
It was a fight over the physical control of a proven, nearly indestructible logistical network.
Right. The organization's transition to synthetic manufacturing and its integration into massive commercial trade flows meant that the operational cells could function relatively independently.
The systemic vulnerabilities they exploited did not disappear with the arrest of one man. Which brings us to the core takeaways from the documentation we've explored today.
We tracked a really incredible trajectory.
We did. From a deported, low-level dealer who acquired the institutional blueprint of the state by becoming a police officer, to the head of a paramilitary synthetic drug empire fueled by global loopholes.
We saw how the CJNG utilized that insider knowledge to exploit systemic corruption, and how their strategic pivot to synthetic drugs fundamentally altered the economics of the illicit market,
allowing them to scale like an industrial manufacturer. We examined the logistics of their paramilitary enforcement and how they weaponized the sheer mathematical volume of legitimate international trade agreements to shield their operations.
And ultimately, we unpacked how removing the chief executive in 2026 didn't dismantle the supply chain, but rather triggered a violent fragmentation as factions fought to inherit the infrastructure.
And why does this matter to you, the listener?
Because understanding this specific narrative is crucial. It illustrates that modern criminal enterprises are deeply entangled with global trade, systemic vulnerabilities, and international policy.
Whenever you observe the efficiency of global commerce, how quickly raw materials can be sourced, manufactured, and shipped across the world, you have to recognize that illicit syndicates are leveraging those identical interconnected systems.
This is not a localized issue. It is a complex reality of global supply chain economics.
It completely reframes how you look at international logistics. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, provocative question to ponder based on the source's conclusion.
It's a sobering reality.
It really is. We've examined the resilience of these decentralized networks. We know that the physical infrastructure of the supply chain survives the loss of its leadership. So if cutting the head off the snake only triggers narco-terrorism and leaves the international supply chain perfectly intact, does the traditional law enforcement strategy of targeting the kingpin actually work? Or does it just create a much more chaotic, dangerous world?
That is the pivotal question for the future of international security.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We love analyzing these complex global systems with you, and we warmly encourage you to keep questioning the surface-level narratives and keep exploring the incredible complexities of the world around you.